Hello back again on the Top Recap channel. This time I will tell a movie's entitled The Devil Comes to Kansas City. Let's get straight into the storyline. At the film's beginning, we are introduced to a rancher named Paul, who has just finished his work. Next, Paul hurried home because it was getting late. Upon arriving home, Paul was immediately welcomed by his wife and one of his children, Rebecca. His wife had just finished cooking, so she asked Paul if they should eat first.
Can't wait to be a farmer too.
You're not going to be a farmer.
While eating together, his wife invited Paul to watch a theater performance in Kansas City tonight. Hearing this, Paul apologized that he couldn't come because he had to deliver 100 cattle to the next town tonight. Finally, Paul told only his wife and Rebecca to go to the theater. Then, Paul said that he had a childhood friend in Kansas City, so if his wife and Rebecca stayed overnight, they could spend the night at his friend's house. The wife agreed, and she would leave with Rebecca only. Not long after that, Paul had a work colleague who invited him to prepare for the delivery of 100 head of cattle. Immediately, Paul said goodbye to his wife and Rebecca. He also did not forget to ask them both to be careful and keep in touch. In the late afternoon, Paul is seen preparing all the cattle while his wife and Rebecca prepare to leave for Kansas City. The scene moves to Kansas City, where we are introduced to a mob boss named Jimmy. Jimmy is seen to be furious, even to the point of killing one of his men for letting some of his kidnapped women escape.
Don't need you anymore.
After that, Jimmy ordered his right-hand man to kidnap several women to replace the women who had previously escaped. Later, Jimmy enters the room and chats with his advisors to discuss how their business can grow.
Shit, no brains is fucked up my flow.
The scene moves to Paul, who goes to his father's house to borrow a truck because he lacks a vehicle to transport his cattle. Once inside, his father invites him to chat while watching a football match.
Katie and Rebecca, where are they?
They got that kids play thing.
Not long after, Paul is contacted by his daughter, Rebecca, by a video call. Rebecca wanted to let him know that she and her mother would soon be arriving at the theater's parking lot. Paul asked them both to be careful and keep him posted. Later, Rebecca and her mother arrived at the car park, and the video call was still connected with Paul. However, two men suddenly approached just as they both got out of the car. Apparently, they are Jimmy's right-hand man, the mob boss. Paul's wife tried to keep the men away, but they immediately arrested Rebecca and Paul's wife. Paul, who saw the incident through a video call, panicked. At the same time, Paul's wife tried to fight back until Jimmy's right hand finally shot her to death. The incident was witnessed by Paul, who could only cry when he saw his wife shot and Rebecca kidnapped. Paul's father tried to calm him down and asked him to stop crying. He said that in a situation like this, it was not time to mourn but to act. He told Paul to get his weapons and slaughter the kidnappers. Here, it is revealed that Paul and his father are former American mercenaries who once worked for the government.
Fucking priority. You bring your daughter home!
Finally, Paul rushes home to get his weapons, while his father immediately calls Paul's two friends and asks them to come over right now. Ten minutes later, the father was seen with Paul's two friends. It is learned that the friend wearing the hat is Isaac, while the one not is Bolin. The father explained that they had to help Paul find Rebecca, who had just been kidnapped in Kansas City. In fact, the kidnapper had also killed Paul's wife, so they had to avenge them. Bolin asked, "Why don't we just go to the police?" His father replied that it would be useless because going to the police would only cost them money.
Okay, stay sharp. He is going to need you. Trust me.
Not long after, Paul came back with his weapons. His father immediately explained that Paul would be accompanied by Bolin, Isaac, and himself. The three of them would continue to help Paul until they succeeded in bringing Rebecca home and slaughtering the kidnappers. However, given his age, Paul requested that his father not come along. Paul would only go with Bolin and Isaac, and that too if they were both willing. Luckily, Bolin and Isaac don't mind helping Paul, so they go straight to Kansas City.
Bring my granddaughter home.
The scene switches to two of Jimmy's men dumping Paul's wife's body somewhere.
Don't eat the sausage in Kansas City.
Meanwhile, Rebecca is held captive by Jimmy's right hand and put together with another woman who is also a victim of kidnapping. It seemed that the woman was very sorry for Rebecca, considering her young age. On the other hand, Paul, Bolin, and Isaac were seen arriving in Kansas City. Paul's main goal is to go around the theater where the kidnapping scene occurred. Upon arrival, Paul still remembered that his wife was killed, and Rebecca was kidnapped in a parking lot where the road was still gravel.
I bet that guy knows something.
At the same time, Paul saw a clown. He decided to ask about the existence of a parking lot where the road was still gravel. However, the clown asked for money first. This made Paul angry, and he taught him a little lesson.
I didn't know she was...
In the end, the clown asks for forgiveness and is even willing to take Paul to the parking lot in question.
Stop it! Tell me! There's only one! There's one!
Thanks to the clown's help, Paul, Isaac, and Bolin found his wife's car. Then, Paul asked Bolin and Isaac to look for the kidnappers in the surrounding area while he would check his late wife's car first. Not long after, Paul saw Jimmy's right-hand man and one of his men wandering around looking for prey. Paul shouted at them to ask for information. However, they both ran away. This made Paul suspicious and finally opened fire. The shot managed to hit his men, while the right-hand man managed to escape. At the same time, Bolin and Isaac arrived. Paul immediately took the man who had been shot into the car for further interrogation.
Let's go! Let's go!
30 minutes later, Paul took the man to an empty warehouse. In retrospect, Paul realized that this person was one of the perpetrators who had arrested his wife, as he had seen him on video. Before interrogation, Paul prefers to teach the man a brutal lesson.
Someone hand me my toolbox. This is gonna hurt a lot.
Seeing Paul being so cruel, Bolin and Isaac tried to stop him. However, Paul did not listen and continued to beat the man. After beating him up, Paul asked where his daughter was. The man simply replied, "Westport."
You remember my daughter! Westport.
Shortly after that, he collapsed because he could not withstand Paul's torture. Seeing Paul, who was difficult to direct, Bolin could no longer follow Paul. He chose to go home first because he was not used to that kind of thing.
I just want to go home.
Paul invited Bolin if he wanted to leave, and he even asked Isaac to leave as well.
Yeah.
In the end, Bolin decides to go home, while Isaac chooses to stay with Paul. On the way, Paul asked Isaac to check on the internet about what Westport was. After checking, it turns out that Westport is a clinic owned by a dentist that still exists in Kansas City. Quickly, Paul and Isaac decided to go to the clinic. Upon arrival, Paul and Isaac immediately barged in while carrying weapons. When inside, it turns out that the clinic is just a front because it is actually a party location for addicts. Not long after, Paul and Isaac managed to find a clinic's owner, often referred to as the dentist, and the man tried to escape from there. Fortunately, Paul caught up with him and interrogated the dentist. Paul showed him a picture of his daughter, Rebecca, and asked where she was. The dentist replies that Rebecca is at the screen printing factory owned by Jimmy, the mob boss. Actually, the factory was also just a front, as it was used for human trafficking and illicit goods. Later, Paul again asked why the dentist knew so much about Rebecca's kidnapping. The dentist replied that he owned a 20% share of all Jimmy's businesses. Next, Paul forced the dentist to drive him to the screen printing factory where Rebecca was being held hostage. However, just out of the clinic, Jimmy's group suddenly arrived and immediately surrounded Paul. Here, Paul threatened to kill the dentist if Jimmy did not obey his orders. However, Jimmy laughed and said that it would be to his advantage if the dentist died. Then, Jimmy ordered his right hand to finish them all, including the dentist, until a shootout finally occurred. Outnumbered, Paul is shot and eventually falls unconscious. Meanwhile, Isaac and the dentist died on the spot. Jimmy then ordered his right-hand man to take Paul to the headquarters and execute him there. Upon arrival at the headquarters, Paul was about to be dropped off by two of Jimmy's men. However, a musician suddenly appeared and killed the two men with his guitar, then took Paul away.
Doesn't look like they hit your lungs.
When he woke up, Paul was already in a house, although his wounds were only bandaged and not fully treated. Paul went out to find out who had saved him. As it turned out, it was Randall. He was Paul's childhood friend, who had previously told his late wife. Paul immediately thanked Randall for saving him. Then, Randall explained that Paul was injured quite badly because there were several bullets still lodged in his body. The plan was to take Paul to the hospital today so that his wounds could be treated immediately. However, Paul refused because he had no time to go to the hospital. Paul also told Randall that he was hunting Jimmy because he had killed his wife and kidnapped his daughter, Rebecca. Before continuing the conversation, Randall invited Paul to continue chatting inside, because it was getting hot outside. Inside, Randall showed concern for all the trouble Paul was going through. However, it would be useless if Paul insisted on leaving in this condition. Randall then explained that he had a friend who was a shaman and the head of a sect. He was known to be very powerful and could heal all kinds of wounds with just one touch. So, if Paul wanted, Randall would take him to the shaman's place. Because this was the only way Paul's wounds could possibly heal instantly. Believing or not, Paul finally agreed to Randall's suggestion, and they both set off immediately.
Come on. Let's go.
Long story short, Paul and Randall arrived at the shaman's place. There, Randall immediately introduced Paul to the shaman and explained his intentions. Knowing that Paul wanted to recover from his gunshot wound, the shaman said that it was a very easy thing to do. However, it was not free, as Paul had to pay for it by joining a sect led by the shaman. Finally, Paul agreed, as long as the wound could be healed on the spot. With just one touch, Paul's wound was instantly healed. In fact, Paul's clothes, which had been filled with blood, were now clean again. Seeing this, Paul could not believe that there were people as great as the shamans in America. Paul promised to join the sect, but later, after he managed to bring Rebecca home and finish off Jimmy's group. Fortunately, the shaman had no problem with this as long as Paul kept his promise. After that, Paul and Randall said goodbye because they planned to slaughter Jimmy's group today. While outside, Randall decided to help Paul. Randall also hates Jimmy, who always makes trouble in Kansas City. Finally, they both go to Jimmy's screen printing factory to save Rebecca. Upon arrival, it appears that the factory is heavily guarded by Jimmy's men. Meanwhile, Randall and Paul decided to take their weapons first because they had no weapons.
Thine will be done who trespass against us.
A few moments later, Paul is seen doodling his face like a military man because soon he will start attacking Jimmy's headquarters. Meanwhile, Randall sneaks in first through the back. Shortly afterward, Paul kicked into action and took out Jimmy's guards one by one. Meanwhile, Rebecca, Paul's daughter, is shown to have a very high fever. A female prisoner had called the guard to ask for medicine because Rebecca was sick. However, unfortunately, the guard instead gave her a banned substance that immediately killed Rebecca. Seeing this, the woman tried to fight the guard until she finally finished him. Then, the woman tried to escape while carrying the guard's weapon. She managed to finish off several guards outside, then stole a car to escape. Meanwhile, Randall, who had managed to get in, began to use his guitar. Back to Paul, he had to deal with Jimmy's right hand. The fight lasted quite a long time, but in the end, Paul managed to finish off Jimmy's confidant. Next, Paul entered Jimmy's room. However, no one was there, so Paul could only shout, asking Jimmy to come out. At the same time, Jimmy suddenly appeared, shooting Paul in the leg. Here, Jimmy says that he applauds Paul's unyielding courage. However, what was all that for? Because now, according to him, Rebecca, Paul's daughter, is dead. Hearing this makes Paul even angrier, and he tries to fight back with all his might. However, because Paul was already badly wounded, he was eventually cornered by Jimmy and almost finished off. However, suddenly, as a result of that one shot, Jimmy was killed. It was clear that it was Randall who shot him. Next, Randall tries to resuscitate the dying Paul. At the same time, we are shown Paul's dream, which is suddenly visited by his wife and daughter, Rebecca, dressed in all white. Paul immediately hugged them both while apologizing that he couldn't save them. Then, Paul decides to come with them, which means that in the real world, Paul has died. Seeing Paul, who was no longer breathing, Randall decided to leave with a deep sadness. However, fortunately, Paul did not join the sect led by the shaman because it was later discovered that it was a heretical sect.